I can't stress this enough. What you're about to see is in no way a leveling build. This isn't something you can just choose to do. This isn't something you can luck into. You're going to have to grind to get the gear to make this happen. But once you do, you finally get to play the Infinite Darkness, Bone Spirit, Bone Spear, Blood Orb build. I know that makes absolutely no sense. Let's just go back into this Nightmare Dungeon. I'm currently running a tier 16. All of the monsters are 6 levels higher than me, and I'm just kind of walking up and spanking them all. All right, so here we go. We have a big guy. I do my Corpse Tendrils, and there he is, and I cast the Bone Spirit, and they're all dead. Scene transition, new shirt, new me, same video. What I'm about to show you looks like the run-of-the-mill endgame Bone Spirit Necromancer. You generate a bunch of essence, you explode them once you have them vulnerable or all crowd controlled or some effect, and you get the maximum bonus out of your Bone Spirit possible. The big difference here though is that we're not only casting our own Bone Spirits, but we're also getting free Bone Spirits. And because we're trying to generate as many Blood Orbs as possible, which is distinctly not a blood skill thing, the skill tree has to do a lot of heavy lifting, and then the rest of our aspects come in to transform all of the different skills that we're using. And once you put this Megatron together, the clear speed and the damage output become truly ridiculous. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go ahead and look at the skill tree. So right off the bat, it's already a little bit interesting. Typically on a build, you don't have two different spenders, but we are both using Bone Spear as well as using Bone Spirit, because Bone Spirit helps to close the gaps that Bone Spirit can't hit in, and Bone Spirit helps to output the damage that Bone Spear in the end game just can't really keep up with. But we're still using Reap with Acolyte's Reap to be able to generate a corpse. You'll notice we only have a single rank in Bone Spear. The skill itself on rank 3, if you have +2 from your gear, bare minimum, is already doing 100% weapon damage in a piercing, full vulnerable applying, multi-hit, multi-procking skill. It overperforms like no other skill can, and I've found that just having the single point in it is more than good enough. But you'll also notice that we're not worrying about picking up things like Imperfectly Balanced. While we do want the Unliving Energy for the maximum essence for Bone Spirit to do more damage, we don't really care about this because Bone Spear is really just a tool. It's part of our Swiss Army knife in case we ever have a single target that happened to survive Bone Spirit. So while it's on cooldown, we set this up, and then we also use Bone Spear just for applying vulnerable with one of our aspects, which you'll see later on. 3 points into Hued Flesh to generate a ton of corpses. We're using the Miasma Corpse Explosion to have a ton of dots out there, all applying Lucky Hit and generating massive amounts of corpses for us as well. We want to be consuming corpses at a precipitous rate because of another aspect that we have. So this engine is really key to the overall success here. Because we're a corpse consumption build, we're also using 3 to Grim Harvest, 3 to Fueled by Death. And it's at this node that you realize that the skill tree is already a little bit different than you would typically expect. As opposed to using the very powerful vulnerability on Corpse Tendrils, we're actually using the Corpse Tendrils has a 30% chance to generate Blood Orbs. You can already put the puzzle pieces together. We need to generate the Blood Orbs to be able to get the free cast of Bone Spirit from our gear, but it goes so much more beyond that. Bare minimum, this also helps us to increase the overall effectiveness of Bone Spirit since it brings everything into a single area. It also applies slow and stun, which is really important for another one of our aspects, to be able to generate a ton of essence for us whenever we apply crowd control. And all in all, the utility of this skill is still here, and this little bit of spice is where it gets a lot more interesting. Maxing out Bone Spirit, maxing out the chance to crit with Bone Spirit. You'll notice I'm not using the Bone Spirit generates essence after the next 4 seconds. I don't really think that this one is as important because we are generating essence at a ridiculous rate via corpse consumption. And I would much rather have a closer to 100% chance to crit, because when Bone Spirit crits on a pack, it feels really, really good. And when Bone Spirit doesn't crit on a pack, it feels like you spent a very, very expensive Bone Spear. Maxing out everything in the Bone passive, except for the Essence reduces cooldown. Now this is typically really important on a Bone Spirit build, but since we're cheating out so many free Bone Spirits, we don't have to worry about that as much. Our rate of Bone Spirit casting is pretty high already. And then here is where you might notice a few other additions to this build that make it kind of interesting. We're using Reaper's Pursuit and Crippling Darkness. Why would we possibly be using this on a full bone build? Well, it's because our Corpse Explosion is a darkness shadow damage dealing skill. Now, all of a sudden, not only is our Corpse Explosion keeping up continuous damage on targets, applying a ton of lucky hits, and consuming corpses to feed our engine, but now it's also applying tons of crowd control to further increase our ability to generate essence from the Umbral aspect, and on top of that, actually be able to apply stagger to bosses for longer fights like the world boss. We are also using Bone Storm here, Bone Storm for the damage reduction and the critical strike chance. You absolutely want this on any bone build, but it has an even stronger ability later on from our aspects that we'll touch on, and then obviously the Ossified Essence key passive. Now, not only does this make the bone spirits that we actually cast ourselves stronger, but the specific verbiage here says that a free bone spirit is spawned dealing bonus damage based on your current life percent. This is like us casting the bone spirit ourselves. And Ossified Essence says that it checks how much resource you have when a bone skill is cast, not how much is consumed on cast, which is a specific keyword inside of Bone Spirit. So right here, our free Bone Spirits also benefit from the Ossified Essence passive, even though we're not actually expending any resource to cast them. This is going to be important for some of our other gear and why we make the decisions that we do. But I've alluded to it enough, let's start talking about aspects that we're using to empower this build further. The first one, and probably the most important one, may fly under your radar if you think, oh, this is actually just a Bone Spirit build, but it is the Bone Spirit Splintering aspect. This allows us to use 1.1 rank Bone Spear as a complete vulnerability applying missile that pierces and hits monsters multiple times. So not only is it doing more damage because of this aspect, but it makes it so that we can have near continuous uptime on vulnerable, which is something that the Bone Spirit build can't typically do unless you're using the Corpse Tendrils modifier, which we aren't. And let me just touch on this again very quickly. The armor needs us to pick up Blood Orbs as fast as possible. On a minimum roll, it only needs 5 Blood Orbs to be able to spawn a Bone Spirit, and on maximum roll, it requires 10. So what roll you get in this will drastically change how efficient your build is. But because of this, we need multiple avenues of generating as many Blood Orbs as possible. So Corpse Tendrils has a 30% chance for each monster hit when it pulls them in to be able to generate a Blood Orb, and all the Blood Orbs are right on top of the monsters where they get pulled in. So when you dash into a pack of monsters, you're going to hit a ton of Blood Orbs, and you're already within minimum range, and they're already all pulled in, so your free Bone Spirit is going to hit all of them. And that's where a ton of our free clear speed comes from. But then we have another very unassuming aspect here, which says that consuming a corpse will generate a Blood Orb up to 30% of the time. Now, I've talked about how hungry we are for corpses and that we're a corpse consumption fuel engine for our build, and this is why. Every single time that we use Corpse Explosion, it has a chance to generate a Blood Orb. And then you may ask yourself, how can you possibly consume corpses more efficiently than casting Corpse Explosion? If we look at the actual animation rate of Corpse Explosion itself, it's pretty fast, right? This animation is pretty fast. The problem being that every time that we're doing this animation, we're not using our generator, we're not using Corpse Tendrils. So the time that we take to consume corpses this way can actually be very inefficient for generating Blood Orbs. And that's where Bone Storm consumes 8 corpses comes into play. Bone Storm, if it's within range, will consume any corpse up to a maximum of 8 to increase its duration. So not only do we now have a Bone Storm that lasts for longer, gives us DR for longer, gives us crit chance for longer, but now it's part of the engine for consuming corpses. It consuming 8 corpses is 8 triggers of 30% chance to generate a Blood Orb. It is 8 triggers of gain 9 essence. It's 8 triggers of maintaining your 9% damage increase up for its maximum duration. And then it's also 8 triggers to immediately activate our Flesh Eater legendary node from our Paragon system that says consuming 5 corpses gives us a 40% multiplicative damage modifier for all of our damage for 6 seconds. Bone Storm becomes a very, very good option with just this aspect. And then there's a second aspect that makes it just that much better, which is Bone Storm, whenever it deals an enemy, which it can hit all enemies within range twice per second, generates up to 5% of your base life as barrier over 10 seconds, so over its typical length, and then that barrier will maintain itself for 10 seconds after, as long as it's not depleted by damage. So Bone Storm becomes our damage buff, our resource generator, our damage activators, our survivability skill, our secondary survivability skill. It is absolutely nuts that these two aspects in concert make Bone Storm into arguably one of the strongest skills the Necromancer has. And the last thing that I think we should really deep dive on is just how powerful restoring upwards of 4 resource whenever you apply crowd control to an enemy really is. Corpse Tendrils applies crowd control to every enemy within range twice per use of the skill. Once when it actually spits out and applies slow, and then the second time when it pulls everything in and applies stun. So if you have 10 enemies and you only roll the average of 2 resource on Umbral, that means that 1 Corpse Tendrils is generating you 40 essence per activation completely for free. Corpse Explosion, with its lucky hit chance base of 40%, being a shadow damage skill that ticks twice per second per cast, so that's roughly 6% of the time that it ticks per enemy that it hits, it will apply stun. And every time it applies stun, even if they're already stunned, you generate that essence as well. You can have multiple Corpse Explosions going at the same time. I would say on average you can have about 5 going simultaneously. Each one ticks twice per second, so that's each time per second you have 10 attempts at 6% chance to hit, applying stun and generating free essence, while simultaneously generating a ton of crowd control for you, which equates to survivability and being able to maximize your damage output. For the rest of the aspects, they're all just typically very good aspects for builds that are looking to maximize crit. So we're using the gain crit chance when you cast Corpse Tendrils, and also gain additional crit damage when you cast Corpse Tendrils. And since Corpse Tendrils is the perfect opener for the build to pull everything in to make Bone Spirit and Bone Spear as effective as possible, just having an additional 10% chance to crit, and then 30 additional multiplicative critical strike damage is absolutely fantastic, as you can imagine. We also have Boots, which can both roll +2 to Corpse Tendrils to reduce their cooldown on being able to use that skill more often, and +2 to Bone Spirit to increase its base skill damage. But you can also add on critical strikes, increase your movement speed upwards of 6 seconds. So all of a sudden, every time that we massively crit on an entire pack of monsters, we're running off to the next pack of monsters altogether that much more quickly. And then lastly, the secondary key passive modifier here, which now says that our ossified essence now also increases our critical strike damage according to how much essence we have above 50 when cast. So as you can see, while the build would be more than good enough as is, this addition of a need to generate Blood Orbs, but also getting such a huge benefit out of it, took the typical Bone Spirit build, which is just bone damage, crowd control through Corpse Tendrils, and then Corpse Explosion for mana generation, and turned it into a Darkness, Blood, Bone build that actually uses an ultimate that the Necromancer typically doesn't. I haven't necessarily felt like I have to have Blood Mist on this build at this point. There's technically a world where you can actually put 1 point Blood Mist, actually drop the Reap generator altogether, and just use Bone Spear and hope that you proc chance to generate a corpse to be able to set up your fights, but I think that that's a little less than optimal, but it's definitely there in case you're looking for that survivability. Or you could drop the Bone Spear portion of it, which means that you have less uptime on vulnerability, which is going to get weaker and weaker the more that you prioritize critical strike chance and get closer to 100% chance to crit anyways. So there's wiggle room in the build to be able to add that additional survivability. And what you have is just by far what I think is the most powerful Necromancer build. Now, I want to make this abundantly clear. I didn't invent this thing. I did finally put all the pieces together, and I think I have a very fine-tuned version of it, but this is something that was reported on from the endgame beta, and I know that a lot of people who are in the know have had a lot of time playing with this build, and we can all say very confidently that it is by far the strongest version of the build, and just puts out such an amazing amount of consistent damage, which is really one of the pain points for the Necromancer, especially in the endgame. Just to reiterate, while I can't tell you you can just start playing this build from the jump, it bare minimum requires you to have this unique item, and hopefully with a good enough roll to make it worth your time. But there is a base endgame Bone Spirit build that is just slightly less efficient than this one and less specialized. So it actually has more room for just doing your more average amounts of damage, average clear speed, and is able to slot in a bit more survivability a bit more easily. But once you put all these Megazord pieces together, you get a truly ridiculous build. So If you've never seen this thing before, welcome to it. I absolutely love this build. If this is something that you're hoping to try out yourself, I just want you to know that it absolutely wrecks shop. It still does amazingly well, even though they have nerfed the explosive miss aspect, which was typically the usual generator and engine for this thing. So we've had to get a little creative, but I really hope that if you're on the Necromancer and you haven't tried this yet, you absolutely take this thing for a whirl. It is a ton of fun, and I'm absolutely smashing content in tier 4 right now with no hesitation and no problem at all. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, come join us down in the Discord, leave a like and a comment on the video. I would really appreciate that. And if you're brand new to the channel, consider subscribing. We're going to be putting out a ton of high quality Diablo 4 content as this game evolves, and I'd love to have you here with us. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it helped, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.